January 17, 1944. Dawn breaks over Tarawa Atoll. The sky is not yet gold. It is gray, streaked with the color of wet ash. The air smells of salt and aviation fuel. On the deck of the USS Essex, a young maintenance crewman named Joseph Keller stands beneath the wing of a Grumman F-6F Hellcat, his hands black with grease, his breath visible in the cold Pacific morning. He runs his palm along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the rivets beneath his fingertips, the cold metal that seems to hum with something he cannot name. Above him, the plane's dark blue paint absorbs what little light there is. It looks heavy. It looks immovable. It looks like it was built not to fly, but to survive. Across the water, 300 miles to the north, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service wakes in his bunk aboard the carrier Zukaku. His hands are steady. His mind is clear. He has flown the Mitsubishi A6M0 for nearly 3 years, and in that time, he has learned to think of his aircraft not as a machine, but as an extension of his own body. Light, agile, responsive. He has shot down more than 60 enemy planes. He has seen the fires of Pearl Harbor and the smoke over Guadalcanal. He has learned to measure his life in fuel gauges and ammunition counters. And he has learned, above all, that air combat is a dance, a matter of speed, of angles, of the perfect turn at the perfect moment. He believes, as all Zero pilots believe, that the war in the air belongs to those who are fastest, most maneuverable, most willing to strip away all excess weight in pursuit of grace. He believes that American pilots are clumsy, that their planes are lumbering, that their doctrine is rigid. He believes this because it has been true. But something is about to change. The Hellcat is not beautiful. It does not inspire poetry. When the first prototypes arrived in 1942, many American pilots looked at them with suspicion, even disappointment. They were bulky, almost brutish in appearance, with wide wings and a blunt nose. Compared to the sleek lines of the Zero, the Hellcat looked like it had been assembled in a factory that built tractors. It was heavier by nearly 2,000 pounds. It was slower in a climb. It could not turn as tightly. On paper, it seemed like a step backward, a compromise born of desperation. But paper does not bleed. Paper does not burn. And the men who designed the Hellcat, Roy Grumman and his team of engineers in Bethpage, New York, understood something that the architects of the Zero did not. They understood that war in the air is not only about elegance, it is about endurance. It is about coming home. The Zero was a masterpiece of minimalism. Every ounce of unnecessary weight had been stripped away. It had no armor plating to protect the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A single incendiary round could ignite them, turning the aircraft into a fireball in seconds. It carried no bulletproof glass. Its airframe was thin, almost fragile. But in return for these sacrifices, it gained something extraordinary: maneuverability. In the early years of the Pacific War, American pilots and their Wildcats and Buffaloes learned to fear the Zero's turning radius, the way it could twist in the air like a swallow, the way it seemed to defy physics. Japanese pilots were trained to exploit this advantage, to draw their enemies into dogfights, to circle and climb until the American planes stalled or broke off. And it worked. At Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, at the Java Sea, the Zero dominated the skies. American losses were staggering. The myth of Japanese invincibility grew. But myths are fragile things. They are built on incomplete information, on the narrow experiences of men who do not live long enough to see the whole picture. And by 1943, the picture was changing. American intelligence officers had recovered a nearly intact Zero from the Aleutian Islands after a Japanese pilot crash-landed on a Kutan island. They studied it. They tested it. They measured its strengths and cataloged its weaknesses. And they realized that the Zero's greatest strength, its lightness, its agility, was also its greatest vulnerability. It could not absorb punishment. It could not protect its pilot. It was a knife made of glass. So the Hellcat was designed to be the opposite. It was armored. It had self-sealing fuel tanks. Its cockpit was surrounded by thick plates of steel. Its canopy was reinforced. It carried 6 50-caliber machine guns, each one capable of tearing through metal and flesh with brutal efficiency. It had a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, a roaring beast that could push the Hellcat to speeds the Zero could not match in level flight. It was not built to dance. It was built to hunt, and it was built in numbers that the Japanese could not comprehend. By the end of the war, Grumman would produce more than 12,000 Hellcats. They rolled off the assembly lines in Bethpage like a mechanical tide, each one identical, each one ready. The first major engagement came in August 1943, during the raid on Marcus Island. Hellcats flying from the Essex and the Yorktown encountered Japanese fighters for the first time in significant numbers. The American pilots were nervous. They had heard stories about the Zero, about pilots who had been shot down in seconds, about dogfights that ended in flames. But when the fighting began, something unexpected happened. The Zeros attacked as they always did, diving and turning, trying to force the Americans into a turning battle. But the Hellcat pilots did not turn. They had been trained in new tactics developed specifically to counter the Zero's strengths. They dove, they climbed, they used their speed and their power to control the engagement, to dictate the terms. And when they fired, their guns did not miss. The Zero's thin skin offered no resistance. Planes exploded, planes fell. And the American pilots, for the first time in years, began to feel something they had almost forgotten: confidence. But it was the Japanese pilots who felt something new, something they could not explain. They fired at the Hellcats, and the Hellcats did not fall. They poured bullets into the American planes, saw the tracers strike home, saw the impacts, and still the Hellcats kept flying. They kept climbing. They kept turning back to fight. It was as if the planes were invulnerable, as if they were made of something other than metal. After the battle, Japanese pilots returned to their carriers shaken. They filed reports that their commanders read with disbelief. The enemy fighters absorb damage without effect, one report stated. We hit them repeatedly, but they do not burn. They do not fall. Another pilot, a veteran of Midway, wrote in his diary, "It is as if they do not bleed." This phrase, "these fighters don't bleed," spread through the ranks of the Japanese Naval Air Force like a virus. It was not officially documented in any single report, but it appeared in letters, in diaries, and conversations overheard by translators after the war. It became a kind of shorthand for a realization that was slowly taking hold, that the Americans had built a plane that could survive what the Zero could not, that the philosophy of lightness and grace, which had served Japan so well in the early years of the war, was no longer enough, that the tide was turning. The Hellcat's armor was not magic, it was steel. 212 pounds of it, distributed strategically around the cockpit, the engine, the fuel tanks. When a Japanese bullet struck a Hellcat, it often embedded itself in the armor or passed through non-critical areas or was deflected. The self-sealing fuel tanks, lined with layers of rubber and fabric, would close around bullet holes, preventing leaks, preventing fires. Pilots who would have died in a Zero came home in a Hellcat with dozens of bullet holes in their planes, the metal torn and twisted, but the pilot alive, the engine still running. It was a simple equation. Mass times survival equals victory. The Japanese had built a plane for samurai. The Americans had built a plane for soldiers. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, an engagement the American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the imbalance had become catastrophic. The Japanese launched wave after wave of aircraft from their carriers, hoping to overwhelm the American fleet through sheer numbers. But the Hellcats were waiting. They had radar guidance. They had superior training. They had planes that could take a beating and keep fighting. Over the course of 2 days, American pilots shot down more than 600 Japanese aircraft. The losses were so one-sided that it ceased to feel like combat and began to feel like execution. Japanese pilots, many of them fresh from training, barely experienced, flew their Zeros into a wall of American firepower and simply disappeared. The sky above the Philippine Sea was filled with smoke and falling metal. The water below was littered with debris and bodies. Lieutenant Commander Sakai survived that battle, though many of his comrades did not. In his memoirs, written years after the war, he described the experience with a kind of haunted clarity. He wrote about the feeling of firing at a Hellcat, seeing his rounds hit, and then watching in horror as the plane continued to close, its guns spitting fire, its pilot apparently unharmed. He wrote about the psychological weight of knowing that every engagement was now a gamble, that even if he flew perfectly, even if he maneuvered as he had been taught, the American plane might simply absorb his attack and kill him anyway. He wrote about the growing sense among Japanese pilots that they were not fighting an enemy air force, but an industrial machine, something vast and impersonal and unstoppable. "We were fighting ghosts," he wrote. Ghosts that bled oil instead of blood, that could be shot full of holes and still return to their carriers. We were fighting a nation that could afford to armor its planes, to protect its pilots, to lose 100 aircraft and build 200 more. We were fighting, in the end, ourselves. Our own philosophy, our own sacrifices, reflected back at us in steel. The Hellcats' kill ratio tells the story in numbers. By the end of the war, Hellcats had shot down more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, with a kill-to-loss ratio of 19:1. For every Hellcat lost in combat, 19 Japanese planes were destroyed. It was the most successful naval fighter in history, a record that has never been broken. But the numbers do not capture the human dimension. The way the Hellcat changed the psychology of the air war, the way it broke the myth of the Zero, the way it made American pilots feel not like underdogs, but like hunters. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true, about a Hellcat pilot named Alex Vrasiu. On June 19, 1944, during the Philippine Sea Battle, Vrasiu shot down 6 Japanese planes in a single 8-minute engagement. When he returned to the Lexington, his plane was almost out of ammunition, its wings and fuselage pockmarked with bullet holes. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, counting the impacts, marveling that the plane was still airborne. Vrasiu climbed out of the cockpit, his hands shaking, his flight suit soaked with sweat. A photographer captured the moment, Vrasiu grinning, holding up 6 fingers, his plane behind him looking like it had flown through a hailstorm of lead. But what the photograph does not show is the conversation Vrasiu had with his crew chief later that day. The chief, a man named Donovan, asked Vrasiu if he had been afraid, if he had thought about dying. Vrasiu shook his head. "I wasn't afraid," he said. "I knew the plane would bring me home. I knew it wouldn't let me down. It was a kind of faith, born not of religion, but of engineering. A faith that the men who built these planes had thought of everything, had planned for every contingency, had cared enough to protect the pilots who flew them. This was the deeper wound that the Hellcat inflicted on the Japanese. It was not just a tactical defeat, not just a matter of lost planes and lost pilots. It was an ideological defeat. The Japanese military had built its doctrine around the idea of sacrifice, of the warrior who gives everything, who expects nothing in return, who accepts death as the price of honor. The Zero embodied this philosophy. It asked its pilots to be brave, to be skillful, to be willing to die. And for a time, this worked. But the Hellcat embodied a different philosophy. It said your life has value. It said we will protect you. It said you do not have to die to win. And this message, implicit in every armored plate, in every self-sealing fuel tank, in every pilot who came home with a bullet-riddled plane and a story to tell, was profoundly subversive. It suggested that there was another way to fight a war, a way that did not require martyrdom, a way that measured success not in glorious deaths, but in accumulated victories, in planes that returned, in pilots who lived to fly again. The sound of the Hellcat's engine became a symbol of this philosophy. The R-2800 Double Wasp did not purr or hum, it roared. It was loud, aggressive, unmistakable. Japanese soldiers on the ground learned to recognize it, to dread it. American sailors on carriers learned to love it. The sound of their fighters returning, the sound of survival. There are recordings of Hellcat engines preserved in archives, and even now, decades later, they convey a sense of raw power, of mechanical confidence. It is the sound of a nation that had the resources to build engines with 18 cylinders, that had the fuel to power them, that had the factories to produce them in quantities that seemed limitless. It is the sound of abundance, of a democracy that could arm its warriors and still protect them, that did not ask them to choose between effectiveness and survival. By the final year of the war, Japanese pilots were flying obsolete planes, or planes that were so poorly constructed they fell apart in mid-flight. Fuel shortages meant that training was minimal. New pilots were sent into combat with a few dozen hours of flight time, barely able to control their aircraft, let alone fight. The kamikazes, the suicide pilots, emerged not as a brilliant tactical innovation, but as a desperate admission that conventional air combat was no longer possible, that the only way to damage an American carrier was to turn the pilot himself into a weapon. The Hellcat pilots who intercepted these kamikaze attacks described it as a kind of slaughter. Planes flown by boys who barely knew how to keep level, who flew in straight lines, who did not evade, who simply accepted death. The Hellcats tore them apart, the sky filled with fire and falling metal, and the American pilots felt not triumph, but a kind of hollow sadness, a sense that they were watching the end of something, the collapse of an ideology that had demanded too much from too many. The Hellcat itself became a teacher. Captured Japanese pilots interrogated after the war often spoke about the Hellcat with a kind of grudging respect, even admiration. They described its ruggedness, its firepower, its ability to absorb damage. Some of them, seeing Hellcats up close for the first time, inspecting the armor, the construction, the engineering, expressed astonishment. "We did not know it was possible to build such a plane," one pilot said. "We thought you had to choose speed or protection, maneuverability or firepower. We did not know you could have both. This was the revelation, that American industrial capacity was so vast, so sophisticated, that it could solve problems the Japanese had considered unsolvable. It was not just a matter of building more planes, it was a matter of building better planes. Planes that reflected a fundamentally different relationship between the state and the individual, between the war machine and the human beings who operated it. There is a cemetery in Virginia, Arlington, where many of the Hellcat pilots who did not come home are buried. The headstones are white, uniform, arranged in perfect rows. Some of them are marked with the dates, 1943, 1944, 1945. Some of them are marked with the insignia of the Navy, the anchor and the eagle. If you walk among those stones, you can imagine the lives they represent. The young men who learned to fly, who climbed into the cockpits of Hellcats and took off from carrier decks, who faced the Zeros and the flak and the storms, who fought not because they wanted to die, but because they wanted to live, wanted their country to live, wanted a world where planes had armor and pilots came home. The Hellcat could not save all of them. No machine can do that, but it saved more than it lost, and in doing so, it proved something essential, that protection is not weakness, that caring for the lives of soldiers is not softness, that a nation wealthy enough to armor its planes and skilled enough to make them fly is a nation that can win a war without sacrificing its soul. The last Hellcat rolled off the production line in November 1945, after the war had ended. By then, the factories were already retooling, preparing to build cars and refrigerators and televisions, the machinery of peace. The Hellcats were decommissioned, stripped for parts, sold as scrap, or pushed into the ocean to make room on carrier decks for newer jets. A few were preserved in museums where they sit today under glass, their paint faded, their engines silent. Visitors walk past them, read the plaques, take photographs. Most of them do not know the stories, do not know about the Japanese pilots who wrote in their diaries that these fighters don't bleed, do not know about the armor plates and the self-sealing fuel. Tanks do not know about the philosophy of survival that was built into every rivet, but the planes themselves remember. They remember the roar of the R-2800, the smell of gunpowder and sea spray, the weight of 6.6 50 caliber machine guns, the faces of the young men who flew them. They remember what it meant to be a plane that brought its pilots home. And perhaps that is the lesson, the one that echoes across the decades, that wars are won not only by the brave, but by the protected. That ideology falters when it demands too much sacrifice, when it treats human lives as expendable, when it builds beautiful, fragile machines that burn at the first touch of violence. That a democracy, for all its inefficiencies and compromises, can produce something extraordinary when it decides to protect its people, to invest in their survival, to build machines that say, "You matter. Your life is worth the weight of steel." The Hellcat was not just a fighter plane, it was a statement of values, a mechanical argument about the worth of a human life. And in the skies over the Pacific, in the burning wrecks of Zeros falling into the sea, in the young men who climbed out of their cockpits after battles that should have killed them, that argument was proven true. The sun sets over Tarawa now as it did then, turning the water gold and red. The carriers are gone, the planes are gone, the men are gone. But the idea remains, the simple, profound idea that a nation can choose to protect its warriors, that survival and victory are not opposites, that a plane which does not bleed can still fight, can still win, can still come home. It is an idea worth remembering, in this age or any age, whenever we are tempted to believe that sacrifice is the only path to glory, that suffering is the only proof of commitment. The Hellcat teaches us otherwise. It teaches us that caring is strength, that protection is power, that the true measure of a civilization is not how bravely its people can die, but how well it helps them live.